Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Michael Copeland, and we're here with Benedict Evans, who is digesting 3 hours of Google I/O keynote and then some. Benedict, welcome.
Welcome.
So, 3 hours long, really?
Yeah, and people started making jokes at about the 2.5 hour mark. My suggestion was that they should get Peter Jackson to produce next year's.
It sounds about right.
I mean, what Apple does is they actually have 2 keynotes. So they have the one that everyone knows about, which is 2 hours, and then they have something called State of the Union, where they talk about all the really interesting technical stuff that afternoon. So Apple actually does do 4 hours as well, because there's just so much stuff going on. But Google kind of squeezed it all in, and people started to go to sleep towards the end, I think.
Gilligan's Island, a 3-hour ride or journey, whatever it is.
Yep.
So, in that 3 hours, what stood out for you? Let's sort of tick through some of those things and then dig a little deeper.
So, I think there's a couple of observations here. One is that it seemed like there was relatively little around Android. I mean, there's lots of nice incremental stuff, but there weren't like major strategic moves or major tentpole features. And more of the discussion was around what you might call the satellites. So the wearable device, the fitness, the car, the TV. And, they announced the next version of Android and,
right.
Blah, 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 blah. I think the second thing that I thought was interesting was the move, a sort of a shift in mood. And so there's a pair piece here with WWDC, because obviously WWDC, Apple has had this regime change. Last year they redesigned the OS, they changed the whole management structure. This year they had like this enormous blizzard of announcements. But one of the stuff that came through that was they'd moved from a vertical to horizontal integration organization. Right. So you have Craig Federighi responsible for all the software, for example. And secondly, there was a really big shift in mood. They were much more relaxed, they were much more jokey. All the announcements were about kind of openness and making life easy for developers rather than sort of imposing obligations on them. So all the developers came out of WWDC thinking, wow, this is a different Apple.
Right.
And this year at I/O, obviously, again, Google's had this change in personnel. They now have Sundar running both apps and Android and Chrome. So they've got all the future stuff under one person. And previously, Android was a total black box. They gave you these random numbers every now and then that never quite reconciled with each other. And they haven't given any statistics at all on Android in 9 months. And they've never given any data on Google Play.
Right.
They've given app downloads, but they've never given revenue data. And this year, they threw up a chart of annual monthly active users. Active users. So they've said for the first time that there are now 1 billion active users of Google Android, which doesn't count China and Kindle.
And does that square with kind of what you thought?
It squared more or less with my model. I think my model was like 1.1 or something. So, right. It's within the margin of error, and it's not exactly 1 billion anyway. But the really interesting thing was they gave a number for revenue from Google Play of that they'd paid out $5 billion to developers in the last 12 months and $2 billion in the previous 12 months. And
so $7 billion in 2 years.
Yeah. Roughly. But $5 billion in the last 12 months. Now, Apple said in January that they'd paid out $7 billion in 2013. And if you look at the revenue growth rate, the run rate growth rate, that means that Apple probably paid out $10 billion in the last 12 months.
Right.
And there are, as it might be, 450 million active iOS devices on Earth. So Apple is doing double the developer revenue on half the number of devices.
Explain that.
Well, I mean, it's not actually very surprising at all. On the first hand, that's what everybody in the industry sees.
Right.
You talk to any developer, any publisher, with very few exceptions, this is what everyone sees. Secondly, also what all of our portfolio companies see this. The second thing is...
they see that they can make money from iOS.
Yeah, I mean, this was the number I had in my head yesterday. That Android revenue is something like half of... The Android ARPU is something like a quarter of iOS ARPU.
Right.
And there's a bunch of reasons for this, and you can argue all day about the relative importance. One reason is that Android tends to have a higher market share in lower income countries. One is that it hasn't implemented payment necessarily very well. A lot of those countries, people don't have credit cards, and Google hasn't implemented carrier billing yet. Another reason is that iPhones average $600 and Android phones seem to average about $250 to $300. So it may well be that people in America with the Galaxy S5 are spending the same as people with iPhones, but that's a small percentage of the overall base. You've just got an awful lot of people in there with $100 phones who don't have a credit card, who are just screwing up the averages.
Yep.
Another reason is that you get a sort of self-fulfilling effect with developers. That if developers feel there's no money on Android, they'll either won't support it, or they'll come to it later, or they'll come to it with a different business model that doesn't require in-app purchase. They might go with an ad-supported model instead of an in-app purchase model. So they're actually not giving people on Android the opportunity to spend as much. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that, of course, is that then means that people who want that app or want it first or are willing to pay are more likely to buy an Android because they can't get what they want more likely to buy an iPhone because they can't get it on Android in the first place. So you get this kind of vicious circle of apps, that all the revenue kind of gets sucked over to iPhone because of this interaction of developers and so on. There's a final observation one could suggest that, the kind of people who want to buy iPhone, if you're given the choice of an iPhone and Android, different people, what types of people will make a different choice. And maybe the kinds of people who choose Apple's proposition are just more predisposed to spend money on apps than the kinds of people who choose Android. Right. That is to say, maybe iPhone users really do spend more money than Galaxy S5 users. We don't know. But however you cut this, it means, and I just kind of wrote a quick blog post on sort of benevans.com, it means that there's not so much market share as market shares.
Mm-hmm. Explain that for
me. It depends. So globally, Apple sells 10% of all the phones on Earth, and Android sells 50 or 60% of all the phones on Earth. So Apple's got 15 to 20% share in aggregate. But then in America, it's more like 45-55, and in San Francisco, it's more like 60-65 iPhone, and then in Detroit, it's more like 60-65% Android. And I did a little. If you look at somewhere like if you look at really affluent areas, it's really higher. If you look at emerging markets, then it's all Android, except for very rich people who have iPhones. But then there's very rich people in Brazil.
Right.
I've got all the money, so they get disproportionate share of spending. If you look at India or Indonesia or any of those kinds of markets, it's all BlackBerry and Nokia converting very quickly to iPhone. Conversely, interestingly, in China, actually, Apple has more like 20 or 30% share, appears to have 20 or 30% share of usage, although much lower share of notional sales of devices. So, where are you? What kind of users are you trying to go for? And then if Apple has 2/3 of all the revenue, that is to say 10 billion versus 5 billion, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve massive global reach? Are you trying to monetize that through advertising? Are you Amazon and you just want your app everywhere? Are you producing a beautifully handcrafted game that appeals to a small number of people, and you want people to pay $10 for it? Are you Guilt Group? Are you whatever? So what exactly are you trying to achieve? And I think this is the the kind of one of the broader points here is we're just entering a world of systemic complexity. There will it will not be as easy as it was on the web. There will not be one platform. Right. There will not be one winner. At least not for the next couple of years, foreseeable future anyway. And you're just going to have to get used to that. I think. Changing tack a little bit, and then we'll go on to onto all the satellite things. There's something that I saw in WWDC and sort of kind of expected to see here, and kind of didn't see that much. Actually, let me rephrase that. Kind of did was that you have this kind of divergence in approach in philosophy. That's to say, WWDC was full of cloud, but it was all about cloud as back-end to rich native apps.
Right.
Whereas I/O was all about cloud as cloud, much more. And it was all about the clever stuff that's going on in Chromebook and the clever stuff that's done on Google servers. Now, there was much, much more of that last year. And two of the things where we had hours and hours and hours about Google Plus and all the amazing image processing that Google Plus was going to do for you, which I thought was is a really interesting narrative about the massive volume of photographs and who is better placed to manage 1,000 photographs a month, Google with this amazing cloud service or Apple with this rich native app. And you can argue it both ways, and arguably Google should be able to do cleverer stuff. But we didn't hear a word about any of that this year. We did not hear Google Plus mentioned, except I think there was the one time I actually noticed Google Plus being mentioned was one of the product managers was saying, and another new feature is you can integrate this with Google Plus, and waited for the applause, and there was just dead silence in the room. The only applause line that just went completely hanging. And then Google Glass wasn't mentioned at all.
So just Google Plus's leader, he left Google. So Google Plus is without a hero, perhaps.
Yes.
Google Glass last year was everywhere. I mean, what do you make of these absences?
Well, what can you say? The stuff that's not there because there's another event coming in a month. But Google's been incredibly quiet on Glass for years, and the thing is really is gone nowhere. We don't know. Maybe there'll be something will happen. Maybe it won't. But it feels like it was out there. It was a test. It was a test that didn't work. But, if you remember previous years, there was Buzz and there was Wave and there were all these other Google initiatives that went nowhere. There was Hangouts. True. Remember Hangouts?
True. And Google's, willing to take a flyer on these things, right?
Exactly. I think there's a macro point here that Google is the new Microsoft. And this is the thing that came out really strongly last year and indeed this year, is the sort of self-confidence and the ambition to do absolutely everything to become the global computing platform, to be the people who know computer science and will go out and build shit.
Right.
Build stuff.
Right.
There's Andreessen Horowitz, I'm allowed to swear. And then that kind of takes us on quite nicely to all of the devices.
Yeah, so what was the cool stuff that people were buzzing about, or in fact they were?
So we had three things. We had Android Wear, which has been more or less completely announced before, but we got a full demo of it, which is a platform for a smartwatch. And there's kind of two components to this. One is three components. One is it will, out of the box, it will display all the notifications from the apps on your phone without them having to be adjusted at all on your Android phone, obviously. So, you get Android notifications that are quite, sophisticated. You can see content from the message. You can get a yes or no, which is what Apple also introducing in iOS 8. So you can look at your phone. It tells you you've got a new email. You can say yes or no. You can do turn-by-turn notifications. You can use Google Now. You can do a bunch of stuff there.
Did Google build this hardware themselves? Did they contract it out?
So this is a platform, and they're showing three devices, an LG and a Samsung, that are available like now-ish. Mm-hmm. And then there's a Motorola one with a rather cool circular screen. It looks cool, except if you're actually a developer and it's a watch and you've got about an inch square of screen estate and you've got no idea what size or shape the screen is going to be. How the hell are you supposed to optimize your design if you don't even know if the corners are going to be there or not? So you've got to optimize for a circular display, even though it might be a square display. So you've got to ignore whatever it is, a third of the screen, and assume it might not be there. It's like, oh, thanks very much. But anyway, the Motorola one ships in the summer, apparently.
Do you want one?
So do I want it? I had this funny feeling being reminded of the iPad demo. And there was a moment in the original iPad demo when Steve Jobs was sitting in a Corbusier leather armchair on stage, holding an iPad, and he was just kind of browsing, and he's saying, so I'm just like, I'm browsing the internet. And it felt, for like this horrible moment, it felt totally underwhelming. It's like, you're just browsing the internet, dude. There's nothing cool about that.
Right.
Which is what, 9/10 of people who are watching the event said it was just a big iPod Touch. What a stupid idea. But my point is, I was sitting watching the demo, and I'm thinking, so you just said you just saw what your email was, and that's actually not very exciting at all.
Right.
And I think somebody did a mock-up of they posted a photo of a mock-up of a smartwatch where they'd just taken a pen and written, "You always have email" on their wrist. And then somebody else replied, and they took a pen and they wrote, "You should exercise more" on their wrist. I don't need a watch that tells me to exercise more. I'm married, I get that already. So you kind of look at it and you think, is this the iPad mistake, that you kind of looked at it and you didn't understand how much it changed things, and you have to have it in your hand and use it before you'll understand? Or is it a solution in search of a problem? You can certainly build a narrative that says, well, you shouldn't have to take your phone out of your pocket all the time. And I think they gave a statistic in the event of, let me kind of check my notes, the number of people who, an average Android user checks their phone 120 times a day. So that's 120 times that you wouldn't have to take your phone.
Don't have to take your phone out of the pocket.
But then I was looking at the interface, and it reminded me a lot of my Palm Pilot 15 years ago. Of how kind of painful it was to look at stuff that was squeezed onto that screen. Mm-hmm. Or even more, it reminded me of my feature phones. Like I had a Sony Ericsson W880, which is this fantastically beautiful piece of design. It's little milled slip of aluminium with this little color screen on it, and it showed like 5 lines of text at a time, and actually reading anything on it was incredibly painful. And I'm looking at this guy reading his email on this tiny little screen and thinking, this is a really crappy experience, actually. Which comes back to the point about, drawing on your wrist. A device that tells you have new email has zero value, actually. A device that tells you who you've got new email from actually kind of has zero value. A device that lets you read that email 2 lines at a time or 3 lines at a time has zero value. A device that gives you, but then some of the things are really cool. Something that gives you turn-by-turn navigation as you're walking somewhere, so you're not pulling out your phone and kind of walking down the street looking at your phone. Do I turn left here? Do I turn right there?
Right.
Some of these things are really valuable, but it just feels like it's groping away for absolutely the right use case, and we're not quite there yet. So then you have cars. And
Google Auto.
Yeah, Google Auto, and this isn't terribly new, and indeed Apple has an equivalent product, or fairly similar product. And the elemental concept here is you have a device that is replaced every 10 or 15 years, made by a company that knows fundamentally nothing about software and on-screen user interfaces, and you have a device that's got a rich touchscreen and software made by people who do understand software and is replaced every 2 years. So where should the intelligence be?
Right.
It should probably be in the thing that's replaced every 2 years. And so you should probably have all the clever stuff in the phone, not in the car. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, on the other hand, I can sort of see why it's quite nice to have GPS in your car without having to have a smartphone with you. But, you do have your smartphone with you everywhere. So that's sort of there. The challenge is, 10-year replacement cycles, so it's not going to take off.
So you didn't get the sense that, like, for example, in my Hoopty Volvo, I will be able to upgrade to Google Auto just because I have a smartphone?
Yeah, I think that's the feeling. I feel like generally you're going to have to buy a new car.
Right.
And at that point, you feel like, well, why not just get like a sucker and put your phone on the screen? Why, it's like... stuff like, data analysis and so on is more interesting, but you can use dongles for that, things like automatic and so on. It's interesting, but it's not that interesting. Maybe it's just me, maybe just because I don't have a car.
So, but Google did have health, their version of health.
Yeah, so they have a health thing, which was quite vague, but again, it's an interconnection system for your health devices, rather like Apple's Health Kit, and again, we'll see. And then the final thing was the TV, and this is the third TV thing. So there was Google TV, which was the most spectacular fiasco, and then there was Chromecast, which is actually a really good product and has done well. I mean, they're selling millions of them, much like the Apple TV. It's like it's done well, but only gone so far.
Right.
That's to say, millions of people have got them, not tens or hundreds of millions of people,
right.
And like the Roku and the Vudu and the Hulu and all these they all seem to have two-syllable names.
Right.
I rather amusingly, this time last year, just about 3 weeks before Google I/O, I wrote a blog post saying that I thought the next Apple TV would be a $50 HDMI dongle.
You were wrong. It was $35.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I actually met one of the guys on the Chromecast team, and they said, I looked at that and I thought, who leaked to him? It hadn't even remotely occurred to me that Google would do this, so I did kind of miss part of it. But anyway, there's no prizes for being right in this kind of world. So anyway, so the Chromecast is there. The Chromecast is doing well. The Chromecast has got bumped. There's a bunch of APIs to make it do all the stuff that it should have had the first time around that they had time to do. Like, you can now mirror your entire phone. You can mirror any app onto Chromecast, and there's a bunch of other things like that, which is sensible enough. Google TV. So I should stop playing with my iPhone case. Google TV. Well, there were two basic problems with the first Google TV. The first was it kind of presumed you wanted to use a QWERTY keyboard to navigate and a mouse to interact with your screen. It was basically Android plugged into not into your TV screen. It was Android from your phone plugged into a TV screen, and that was just a terrible experience. And so Sony made this kind of bizarre, like, handheld QWERTY keyboard. It was just dumb.
Oh, right. And Logitech got in on it.
Yeah, Logitech lost an enormous amount of money. That's like hundreds of millions of dollars writing off inventory. So that was the first problem. And so Google have now got a thing which actually has an interface that makes sense 10 feet away and is controlled from your phone. So they've kind of solved that. The second problem was, I'm trying to have two problems or three problems. It's really two problems. And so they've come up with a story around games and a story around having Google Play and having movies. Mm-hmm. So it's basically just like, well, you get an Apple TV or Hulu or Vudu Box or Boxy Box or whatever it is. It's fine. These things are kind of a commodity at this point. But the problem with all of these things, the problem with the Kindle Fire, with the Apple TV, all of this stuff, is that they all don't have the same content. That is to say, they all have marginally interesting content and stuff that isn't the stuff you absolutely have to have.
Right.
So they don't have and to the extent that they do, you only have it if you're a cable subscriber anyway. So
you've already got it.
So you can have HBO on your Apple TV, but only if you already signed up to pay Comcast $150 a month.
Right.
And the fantasy that everybody has is that they could just pay Comcast $30 a month and not have to, and then pay their $50 a month for broadband and have an a la carte product. And of course, absolutely nobody in the entirety of the TV industry has any interest at all in letting you do that.
Right.
That's to say, everybody hates the structure of the US cable and US TV industry, except the US TV industry, who are kind of perfectly happy with it.
Right.
So you look at this thing, and I mean, this is kind of my kind of standard narrative around all these devices, is you look at this thing and it's a beautiful thing and a beautiful interface that you switch away from to get to your cable box so you can watch the stuff you actually want to watch.
To be clear, what they described today or unveiled, if that's the right word, it was just the platform and more software.
And the partnerships with the TV companies.
Yeah.
And the comment that they made on stage, which is exactly the same comment that they made when they launched the original one, is something along the lines of, it's fantastic, we've got all these parts of the TV ecosystem involved. They have no television companies involved.
Right.
That is to say, they have nobody who makes anything you want to watch any more than very peripherally involved in this. Now, that's not quite true. So they've mentioned partnerships with a couple of the IPTV cable television providers in France. So I think SFR and Bouygues, who have quite substantial pay TV operations, are going to use this. But there's no Comcast, there's no ABC, there's no Fox, there's no HBO. This will not change your experience watching Mad Men.
And this won't change your Google TV experience dramatically unless perhaps you live in France, it sounds like. But
yeah, exactly. Or if you live in France or the UK, if you live anywhere that doesn't have this very unique market structure where everybody has cable, everybody pays a huge amount of money, you have to pay a huge amount of money to get anything at all that you want to watch. Nowhere else in the world, nowhere else in the world that I can think of off the top of my head has that market structure.
Right.
So, in the UK, the BBC makes all of its stuff available for free online on any device, and so do all the other TV channels. And if you're a Sky subscriber, which is half the population more or less, then you can have the Sky have these apps, and you can put them on any device, and do whatever you want with it. So it's really only the US that you have this totally locked up gridlock system, and so this is kind of the point, that if you were to say to me, I'm going to disrupt the mobile business, I would say to you, with what spectrum? And if you have no answer to that, then I'm not interested. And in the same sense, if you say to me, I'm going to disrupt the TV business, then I will say, well, with what content? Who's going to make content available to you on your platform? And until you can answer that question, you are basically poking around in the Netflix, Amazon Prime, Blockbuster, reruns, movie, second run. You're pushed out down the exploitation chain, which is the industry term for it. You can't use this beautiful new interface instead of your cable box's interface to watch last night's episode of Girls, last night's episode of whatever it is. So there's that kind of block. It's like, it's great, but and so that was it. So we talked about watches and cars and TVs.
So did you, WWDC was a couple weeks ago, I/O's going on for the next couple of days, but most of what we're going to hear about and see was announced today. Does it change your view of the world vis-a-vis those two companies, Apple and Google? Do you have any sense of momentum? You talked a little bit about mood.
So there's a thing to talk about here, which I think is very interesting. Which is, if you look at all of the stuff that they did in Android, a lot of it is about blurring the lines between what an app is and what a website is, and how you move between the two. And then, 2 hours later, they tell you that you will now be able to run Android apps on your Chromebook, which on one level is completely surreal. It's like, why would you buy, particularly like the Chromebook Pixel? The joke was you could buy a MacBook Pro that for less money that runs Chrome and all your other apps. Why are you buying a Chromebook? Particularly like a $300 Chromebook makes sense. A Chromebook Pixel made no sense at all. And so it's like, okay, so now you can buy a device that runs Chrome and apps are designed to be run on smartphones. Why would you not just why wouldn't you buy a Windows or a Mac? And install Chrome on it? Wouldn't that make more sense? But that's like the obvious example. The more interesting reaction is to say, okay, so we're running Davlik / what's the new runtime? Art? I can't remember. You're running Android native apps inside the Chrome platform. And you're showing it to me on a laptop. And you've also shown me a whole set of technologies for breaking apart the differences between apps and web pages and letting you link between the two. What do we think Android is going to be in 5 years' time? What software do we think is going to be running on that device? What is it going to mean to say an app versus a web page? How much of those different differentiations is going to get broken apart, especially with another 5 years of Moore's Law changing a lot of these kind of performance questions? Because right now you probably couldn't do that Android app within Chrome on a smartphone chip today, but in 5 years' time. So I think that's the kind of strategic pointer. Where are you going to take what it means to say, I installed an app? Where do you address that kind of binary problem of, is the app there or not? How do you run it again? How do you get people to run the app that they installed a month ago and have forgotten about? All of this this kind of Berlin Wall that you have between the web and native code is fading away.
Right.
And you saw this completely the other way from Apple, where they're breaking apart the app into notifications and keyboards and extensions. Obviously, you've had keyboards and actionable notifications on Android for a while. Extensions you haven't had on Android, you have Intense, but then Intense totally differently. But so you've got people poking away. It's like they're not done yet. They've spent the last 6 or 7 years going from the original iPhone and adding all the stuff that kind of needed to be there. Both Apple and Android. And now it's like, okay, what do we do for the next 7 years? And that's going in very, very different directions.
I mean, I've heard you talk about this before, where you say that the richness and complexity and, sheer beauty of the mobile world far outstrips that of sort of the browser-based world.
I'm not trying to talk about beauty. I just think there's this that what the smartphone did was unbundle the internet from the web. Amongst many other things, and it bundled up lots of physical devices like cameras and music players and so on into one device. But in software, in kind of internet terms, everything was in the web,
right? And
now everything is in 2 or 3 or 4 dozen different apps. And then you've got WeChat bundling everything up into an app again. So it's kind of turtles all the way down. It's like WeChat is like, this is the solution to having lots of silos is we've made one big silo.
Bundle it back up again.
Put lots of little tiny silos inside it, which I'm not sure how much sense that makes outside of China. But then you have this kind of moving target, because as Apple and Google sit and iterate and drive that experience forward, what can we do that will make this better? What can we do that will make this work well for our users? And the answer is not, well, we'll delete the App Store and we'll remove the ability to run native code and we'll turn it back into a web browser.
Right.
This sort of bizarre fantasy that somehow everything will go back to being HTML and links and the URLs, and that will be like the kind of the 3 pillars of the internet again, which is the way it was before. It's like we've had this massive unbundling, and that unbundling is getting more and more complex and sophisticated. And it's all going to get bundled back up again at some point in some way in 5 years.
Well, Benedict, I was going to ask you about England's pathetic performance in the World Cup, but
I didn't actually know the match was happening until the day.
But you were focused more on the future of what our experience in mobile and the internet will look like. So we appreciate that, and there will be more where this came from as you digest I/O further.
What else? Yeah, I'm going to have to watch the whole thing again at least once and maybe twice, because it was the same thing I had after WWDC. I think we did the podcast and it's I didn't even mention Cloud Drive or something, so I'd actually have to sit and look at the notes. Is there other stuff that I haven't mentioned that they announced? The updated Chromecast, there's Apple TV, there's Android Auto, there's Android Wear, there's a developer preview of the next version. Oh yeah, I was like, well, here you are. So I didn't mention Android One. So there is now a reference platform to do cheap $100 phones that retains a much greater degree of Google control. So a minimum hardware requirement at under $100 retail, keeping all the software up to date. And
where does this? I thought we had that already, but where does this show up, and why does Google want to do that?
Now it's much more under Google control. The other thing that I think, I'll just throw this in as another sidebar, and then we should kind of go. The other thing that I thought was very interesting is the Android fragmentation conversation. And Apple really likes to talk about this for obvious reasons,
right?
Because they control the platform, so they don't have a software fragmentation problem for all practical purposes. A little bit of hardware fragmentation, but not really. And they also talked about malware, and Sundar was very explicitly taking on those 2 points, and I think with some justice. So, and there's 2 pieces to this. The first is that Google has moved all of its own APIs, or a lot of its own stuff, out of, and I use that in a deliberately vague and untechnical sense, they've moved a lot of their stuff out of the firmware that where you were dependent on your OEM and your mobile operator to put something together, and they generally didn't bother because not they didn't bother, they weren't able to do it for a whole bunch of perfectly legitimate reasons generally. So you had your phone and your phone never got updated after you bought it.
Right.
That's all been moved into a software layer that lives in Google, in the App Store, and that can get updated automatically over the air.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's good news for consumers.
And so this is called Google Play Services. Google Play Services ships a new version every 6 weeks. 93% of the devices that are hitting Google Play are on the latest version. So effectively, 93% of the devices that are being actively used and going online have the latest version of Google Play Services, and Google has started putting all their bug fixes into that. So their Heartbleed fix, all of this stuff goes into that. So from one perspective, the fragmentation problem, the software and the operating system fragmentation problem is kind of much less important than people still like to talk about. It's kind of overstated, I think. And particularly from Google's perspective, they roll out some cool new thing. It's on every Android phone.
Right.
They don't have to wait for you to buy a new phone in 18 months' time with a new version on it. So their new service, their new Maps API, their new this or their cloud service API, whatever it is that they want developers to use, will be on every phone. It's done. However, you have got a range of devices out there selling from anything from $50 to $600.
Right.
And so you've got different hardware out there.
Yeah, not everything.
And very different hardware out there, and some stuff will just not run on some of these things. I've seen data suggesting that the number of Android devices that have Bluetooth LE in Southeast Asia is about 25%.
Oh.
So that's the thing. One of Apple's tentpole features, iBeacon will not work on 3/4 of the Android phones in Southeast Asia. It's just not, the hardware just isn't there to do it. And when you then talk to game developers, you talk to people who've tried to build video apps, anything that actually needs to talk to device drivers and expect some kind of consistent response, like, what is the camera aperture, please? Mm-hmm. And you get a different response on two different versions, on two Samsung Galaxy S5s that were sold in different countries.
Right.
And so the hardware fragmentation, both because of the function of the price, but just, in general, is still really significant. And so therefore you could say that that Android fragmentation is both massively overstated and massively understated, depending on what you're trying to do.
But shouldn't...
So if you want Google Now, or you're building an app that uses the latest Android Maps API, there is effectively almost no fragmentation. If you want to make a cool video chat app, you've got a really serious problem. Making that work consistently across Android devices. It will take you twice as long or 3 times as long as it did to code it on iOS.
But maybe you don't care because you're just shooting for that whatever top third that will run it.
But this comes back to your to that revenue number.
Exactly.
So here you are with the total pot of money to go for on Android is half what it is on iOS. You have to get 4 times the users on Android to get the same ARPU you get on iOS. And you have development costs that, depending on what you're trying to do, are either the same or 2 or 3 or 4 times bigger.
Well, we will unravel this further as you dig into it more. And as always, thank you, Benedict.
Thank you.